her father to apologize. But no, she thought it would be better if she simply became the daughter he wanted her to be. Then he wouldn't constantly associate her with her past. Perhaps then she could develop an identity beyond her struggles, beyond her pain. If she wanted to be loved again, she had no other choice. Finn trudged down the stairs with heavy steps, fingers massaging his temple. The throbs of his pounding headache matched the thud of his footfalls. Despite the fact that Mara had cleared him 4 days ago, the effects of the sickness were still wearing off. Headaches, congestion and coughing lingered, but at least his body didn't feel like it was being torn to shreds anymore. Astrid eyed him from the kitchen as he came in, scooping up a bowl of porridge and sprinkling some nuts and berries on top. Finn shoveled the first few bites in his mouth before he noticed her stare. His eyebrows furrowed in surprise. "What?" Astrid smirked. "Don't talk with your mouth full. Have you learned anything?" Finn rolled his eyes and swallowed. "I've learned to stop streaking through the village at some point, so you can't say that like your parenting skills are completely moot." Adriana's voice wafted from the upstairs urgently, "Streaking through the village." "When you were little," Hiccup replied from the master bedroom. "Oh. Thank gods." Adriana sighed heavily. Finn snickered into his empty bowl, then frowned at the large bowl his mother was mixing in front of him. Astrid rolled her eyes and dropped another huge helping into his bowl. Finn grinned and began to shovel it in, before her stern voice stopped him. "Slow down. I may give you more food than Mara suggested, but I won't have you choking." Hiccup tramped down the stairs with a grin on his face. "Wouldn't want anyone to have to revive you. Keep your filthy lips away from me." Finn muttered. "Trust me, Finn, the only person I plan on kissing anytime soon is your mother. Odin, spare me." Hiccup gave him a devilish grin before grabbing Astrid by the waist. But she had other plans. "Get away from me, freak." Hiccup gasped and even Adriana's laughter could be heard from her bedroom. "You are a horrible person." His grin quickly returned. "You know, the payment for mistreatment of your husband, and Chief, I might add, is a kiss. Take one step closer, Chief, and I will slap you." "Home. I'll take it. Come here." "Ah." "Hiccup, get away from me." "Stop, why are you running away from me?" "Because you're a freak of living nature with your puffy hair, now go away." Astrid laughed. Adriana poked her head down the hallway from the upstairs, joining in Finn's laughter at their parents chasing each other around the lower level of the house like teenagers. The door swung open and Binnen stepped inside, jumping out of the way of a charging Astrid. "Whoa now." Binnen gave the 2 teenagers a confused look. "What's going on?" Hiccup finally grabbed Astrid around the waist and tackled her onto the couch. "Ha! Gotcha." A solid slap across the face nearly broke his grin, but he couldn't help the cry of pain. Finn crowed with laughter at the resounding sound through the house. "Ow-oo-oo." Binnen chortled. "Serves you right, Hiccup." "Finn, take notes." Finn snorted. "Done. I think it's kind of cute." Adriana giggled from the bottom of the stairs, book in hand. Finn rolled his eyes. "You would. Just you wait, fearless Finn. You're going to be the gooeyest husband of them all." Adriana smirked. "Over my cold, dead body." Hiccup smirked. "Now we just have to figure out who the special lady is." A blush began to ride over Finn's face. "Please don't." Finn and Helga kissing in a tree. Astrid began. "Mom." Finn whirled around, horrified. "Kissing." Hiccup and Astrid chanted together. Finn groaned loudly, slamming his forehead against the countertop. "Why me?" "Because there's not much option elsewhere maybe." Adriana quietly replied. The room quickly grew silent, but the parents figured she must be somewhat okay if she said it herself, rather than someone else. Before anyone could say a word to break the lingering silence, Binnen stepped over to her and pulled her into his arms with a warm smile. "Patience. The time will come. Don't ever wish for more than you've been blessed with." Adriana sighed quietly but still gave him a kiss on the cheek before retreating to her upstairs haven. Hiccup and Astrid watched her go with sad expressions, Hiccup biting his lip pensively. "I wish there was something I could do for her," he mused. Benen turned to him with a knowing smile. Patience is a lesson for us all. She'll be okay. She just needs time. As does Eric. He'll come around. Will he? Finn asked. He hasn't cracked a smile in a week, Benen. He just lost his father. Benen replied. These things are to be expected in the grieving process. He will be okay, but don't be surprised if it takes longer than you might expect. Hiccup sighed. We're a living testament to that one. With my dad and Lotus. Astrid nodded quietly in agreement. I can't imagine going through that. Finn ran a hand through his hair. I mean, it hurt when Poppy died, but I didn't really understand it. You were almost 5. Hiccup frowned. It's hard to explain that to a child. Benen glanced around the room and surveyed the dull atmosphere in it. He hated seeing the sad faces, but he knew there was little he could do to cheer them up. Although he knew of something that would lift one Haddock's spirits considerably. Finn Benen broke the silence. Mulch and Bucket's barn was damaged in the blizzard and someone needs to fix it. Shouldn't take more than a few hours. What do you say? Sure. Hiccup straightened up from his seat. I don't know. That barn didn't look very stable. Oh, come on, Dad. I've been practically tied to a bed for days. Let me be free. Okay. Just wear a coat. Hiccup relented. Your warmer one, yes, that one. Astrid piped up when Finn turned to the coat hanger. Moom. I don't want you to get sick again. You're still coming off of it. It could come back. Astrid, leave him be. Hiccup murmured beside her as Finn and Benen threw their coats on. He'll be fine. He paused for a moment. Actually, can I come? You and I haven't spent all that much time together since we got back. I've missed you, buddy. Finn opened his mouth to respond when Adriana pounded down the stairs and grabbed a coat off the hanger. Library, she said breathlessly, turning to the door. Addie, wait. Hiccup stood up and hurried over as his daughter pulled the front door open. Let me walk you down. I know where the library is, Dad. I just want to make sure you're safe. There's a lot of construction going on and anything could happen. Hiccup took his coat off the hanger and stared at his daughter with wide, puppy dog eyes. Just humor me. Thought you were coming with us. Finn grumbled impatiently. I'll meet up with you. Hiccup waved them away. It's fine, you can start without me. Be careful out there. It's icy. Astrid quickly added, ignoring the raised eyebrow thrown to her by her husband. Mom. Finn gave her a deadpan expression through the open doorway. We'll be back before you can say where's he got to now. Benen stood in the doorway, about to follow the Haddock twins outside. But he turned back to the adult Haddocks with a warm smile. Hey, don't beat yourselves up. You did the best you could. Hiccup shrugged. You do what you can, right? Right. Finn and Adriana, they've gone through a lot, but they're good, strong kids. The best way for them to learn is to experience troubles. At the end of the day, it's good for them. For all of you. And Benen paused, trying to put his thoughts to words. No matter what happens or how rough the road gets, don't ever give up on them. They need you more than they'd lead you to believe. Benen. Hiccup began, pausing when his voice caught in his throat. Astrid looked at him curiously, but he quietly continued, thank you. For everything. The cherished family friend opened his mouth to respond, but the voice of an impatient teenager interrupted. Benen, while we're still young. Benen and the Haddocks laughed with rolled eyes at the irony. It was as if Finn had forgotten they had an over 50-year age difference. Benen waved and closed the door behind him and Hiccup before trudging after Finn in the snow. Come on, Benen, we haven't got all day. Finn called impatiently as the elderly man made his way over to the boy. His hands were shoved deep into his pockets as he bounced from one foot to the other, causing Benen's mouth to crack into an amused smile. Patience, Finn, the man replied. Life is far too fleeting for it to be rushed along even further. Finn snorted and began walking towards the village with his friend by his side. We're just fixing a barn. It's not anything that significant. On the contrary, it's the simple, seemingly insignificant things that often matter the most. Bin encountered. Every action is like a pebble dropped into a pond. At first it seems like it won't do much. But the ripples continue to spread far beyond what we can see. Even the smallest acts, good or bad, carry repercussions that more often than not impact things in ways we can't even begin to imagine. I suppose the same could be said for people. I guess, Finn answered with a shrug. On any other day he might have pondered his companion's words further, but his mind was still foggy from the lingering effects of his illness. The two fell into a comfortable silence for the rest of their trek. Any stranger could have easily mistaken the pair for a grandfather and his grandson taking a stroll through the snow. Oddly enough, the assumption wouldn't have been far from the truth. They reached Mulch and Bucket's barn a few minutes later. Finn gasped as the structure came into view. The weight of the snow had apparently proven too much for the roof and had caused the wood to collapse in on itself, leaving a gaping hole. "Hello there." Mulch waved as Finn and Bennen approached. "Bucket, we've got some more recruits," he yelled to the pale-wearing man currently descending a ladder from the roof. "Oi!" Bucket yelled back with a wave of his own. "Thanks for coming out." "Anything we can do to help," Bennen said with a smile. "What would you like us to do?" "Well, we've got a lot of debris inside that needs to be cleared," Mulch replied. "If it's not too much trouble." "No trouble at all. Lead the way." Mulch showed the pair to the entrance of the barn, where two other Burkian men were hauling out an assortment of splintered wood pieces. "Young Finn here can probably help move the larger beams that fell from the roof," Mulch remarked. "You think you can handle the smaller ones, Bennen?" "Of course," the older man answered. He turned to Finn. "Ready to put those muscles to good use?" "Am I ever?" Finn chuckled, and he headed toward the men who were dragging a particularly huge plank out into the snow. For the next few minutes, Finn and Bennen set to work helping the others. Aside from the occasional grunts of effort, things appeared to be going rather smoothly. That is, until a low creaking sound began emanating from the roof overhead. Finn was gathering a large pile of broken wood into his arms when Bennen heard the noise. The young boy appeared to have dismissed it as just another gust of wind blowing through the rafters. But something about the sound caused the older man to glance upward to the space above where his young friend was working. To the right of the boy was the hole where the snow had caused the roof to cave in. But to the left, Bennen dove. What happened next was a blur. All Finn knew for the following few seconds was that suddenly there was a series of loud crashing noises and the sensation of being roughly shoved into a pile of snow. He could hear several shouts from the men as he struggled to stand. When he finally caught his bearings, his throat plummeted into his stomach. The entire right side of the roof had collapsed onto the ground. And Bennen was nowhere to be seen. "Bennen!" Finn screamed, sprinting forward toward the wreckage. Mulch, Bucket, and the three other men who had been helping were running into the barn from outside. "Bennen!" the boy cried, dropping to his knees and scrambling to get through the wreckage. "Bennen!" The cry of distress was met with a faint groan. "Bennen!" Finn cried again, thrusting several smaller planks of wood aside. "Help me!" he shrieked desperately to the other men as they approached. "Benen's in there." But Mulch, Bucket, and the others didn't need to be told. They were already hauling as much debris aside as they could while Finn frantically dug through the mass of wood, still calling for his friend. "Bennen, Bennen, we're going to get you out. Just hang on. FFI. Bennen." The last few pieces of wood Finn had cleared away revealed Benen's pallid face and torso poking out from beneath the rubble. His skin had turned as white as the snow outside and his eyes were wider than Finn had ever seen them, glassy with the tears of a suppressed cry of immense agony. But those things weren't what caused the boy's breath to freeze in his lungs. No, as horrid as the elderly man's face appeared, nothing compared to the gruesome sight just below his chest. There, jutting out from just below the man's ribs, was a jagged piece of a broken roof beam. And surrounding it, a rapidly blooming pool of blood. "Oh gods," Finn whispered, his hands beginning to tremble uncontrollably. Oh gods, Bennen." "Fi," Finn Bennen croaked, weakly lifting an arm and clasping the boy's wrist with as much strength as he could muster. "Oh gods. There's too much debris on his legs. We'll never be able to move this unless we have help. We have to go get Hiccup." Where is he? El Library, Binnen answered in barely a whisper. Finn heard feet pounding against the earth behind him, but his focus was so intently locked on the scarlet ocean spreading across Binnen's abdomen that he barely registered the sound. I have to, Binnen, we're gonna. Finn, the old man wheezed, giving the boy's wrist a squeeze. Finn's gaze met his. The man opened his mouth again to say something more, but he was interrupted by a hacking cough that sent tiny red droplets splattering across Finn's face. We're gonna get you out of here, Finn said hoarsely, pushing down the urge to empty the contents of his stomach. He wrapped both hands around Binnen's hand and squeezed it back tightly. My dad's on the way. You're gonna be okay. Just hang in there. Finn, the man rasped again. He tried to lift his free hand to the boy's face, but just then a shudder of pain rippled through the old man's body, causing him to arch his back with a sharp gasp of anguish. Binnen, the boy shouted in terror, his hands flying to his friend's hopelessly blooded torso. Binnen. Finn. Don't talk. Save your breath. They're coming, okay. Hang on. Finn, ICCA. Don't. You're going to be okay. To the young Haddock's horror, Binnen managed to gather enough strength to just barely shake his head. Finn. I am not. No. Finn yelled, grabbing his friend's hand again. You're going to make it. The old man blinked and the tears he had been holding in began spilling down his weathered cheeks. His lips moved as if he meant to speak again, but he had hardly any breath left and no sound came out. You're going to make it, Finn whispered shakily. He didn't know when they had started falling, but he suddenly became aware of his own hot tears burning trails down his face. I promise. But the old man's last ounce of strength seemed to have nearly been spent. He gazed sadly at the trembling boy above him and once again squeezed his wrist. Everything gasp, will be, gasp, all right. No. Don't talk like that, you're going to make it. Finn, not your fault. Yes it is. Finn wailed. Finn. Binnen's eyes began to cloud over. Stop, the boy shrieked, letting go of the man's hand to desperately shake his shoulders. Stop it. Don't do this, Binnen. Stay with me. Stay with me. Binnen's only response was a sad, wistful smile. He hated to leave Finn like this, but in his heart he knew there was no more time. Still, he sorely wished that he could impart upon the young Haddock just one thing more, one more sign of the care and gratitude he felt for this boy whom he had come to love as his own. And as his breathing began to slow and his vision began to blur into darkness, he suddenly remembered something. Something that he knew for certain would stay with his friend for the rest of his days, even after he himself was long gone. The old man shakily lifted his free arm and slowly moved it toward Finn's body. Binnen, please. Binnen extended a finger and pressed it firmly against the boy's chest. Then, locking eyes with Finn's, he uttered the only word he had enough strength left in him to say. Fortis. And then he was gone. Fie, oh gods. Finn hardly heard the voice of his father coming from the front of the barn, however, for all other sound was suddenly muted. It was like he had gone temporarily deaf. He clutched at Binnen's lifeless face, tears dropping onto the man's cold skin. Binnen. He cried, his voice eerily echoing in the silence. Binnen. Finn. Finn, oh gods, Finn, I'm so sorry. The boy felt hands coming to rest somewhere on his body, but he wriggled himself free. He didn't even know who else was there or what was happening. Everything except Binnen was a blur of undefined shapes and sounds, and nothing else mattered because Binnen wasn't doing anything. He was just lying there and wouldn't move. Binnen, please. Please don't do this. You can't leave now. Come back. Wake up. Finn. Binnen, I'm sorry. Please don't go. Please don't go. He felt hands pulling at him, suddenly trying to drag him away. He screeched and thrashed wildly in protest and practically flung himself forward, grabbing fistfuls of the bloody cloth in an attempt to cling to the body before him. No. Finn screamed. No, 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 no. Finn, baby, you have to let him go. He didn't know how long it had been or when his mother had shown up, but he didn't care. He wasn't going to leave. He couldn't leave. I'm not leaving him. Finn, Honey, he's gone. No. He clenched his fingers more tightly around the soaked fabric of Binen's shirt, but it was no use. A multitude of arms wrapped around him and finally ripped him free of the body, dragging him away. Finn flailed and kicked, trying desperately to make it back. But within moments the energy drained out of him, and all he could do was slump limply in the arms of his now weeping mother and watch helplessly as Toothless and a few more Viking men finally cleared away the rest of the rubble and carried Binen away. Binen. His friend. His best friend. His best friend was gone. Forever. Finn fully succumbed to the tears then, allowing the sobs to rack his body until everything around him once again blurred into nothingness. The next few hours seemed to pass by in a whirlwind of activity. Astrid held her son for what felt like hours, allowing his tears to soak her shirt. She couldn't think of anything to say. It seemed empty to tell him that, though it didn't feel like it, things would one day be all right. She couldn't possibly know that herself. But her little boy seemed to find her presence somewhat soothing nonetheless. Astrid was appreciative of her fellow Burkians as she walked Finn through the village square. Many of them averted their eyes or nodded respectfully to her as she gently led her son up to the house. His hands trembled so violently, she had to wash the blood off of them herself. When she drew him a bath, she waited outside the door for his blood-soaked clothes. There would be no way she could get those stains out. She instead tossed them into the fire and felt an odd sense of satisfaction to watch them burn into nothingness before getting Finn some fresh clothes from his room. Finn didn't speak when he emerged from the washroom. He didn't speak when his mother helped dry off his hair or when she hugged him again before taking him down to the village again. In fact, he was completely silent until the sun was beginning to set and the Haddock family had gathered together at Mara's. By this time, Binen's body had been cleaned off and covered up to the neck with a sheet. When Astrid and Finn arrived, they immediately spotted Adriana sitting on a chair in the farthest corner of the room. She didn't look up when they arrived, choosing instead of stare at her lap and slowly swing her legs back and forth in front of her. Hiccup and Mara were standing next to the body, talking in low voices. Astrid saw her husband nod respectfully to the healer before turning to them. His green eyes gazed at their son, searching for some form of reaction, but Finn only stared at Binen's prone form. Then he blinked and he seemed to realize what was happening. He sharply inhaled and bumped into Astrid, who gently held his shoulders. Finn Hiccup stepped forward with his hands held out. "It's okay, buddy." Astrid squeezed her son's shoulders, searching his face for any sign of panic. "Do you want to sit down?" After a moment Finn shakily nodded. "It's okay if you want to wait." Finn managed to shake his head and move himself forward. He didn't feel himself sink into the chair or his body slump forward. He stared into the blank face of Binen, his best friend of 6.5 years. Binen looked so peaceful he seemed to be merely sleeping, such a sharp contrast to a few hours prior. Anguish washed over him again when the images replayed in his head. He kept asking himself to wake up from this horrible nightmare, but deep down he knew there would be no waking. This wasn't a nightmare. This was just as real as the scars on his back from Ratri's cane that never seemed to fade. Only this was worse. A swish of fabric pulled him back to the present and he noticed Mara kneeling beside him. He forced a placid expression on his face and continued to stare at the face of his old friend. "There was nothing anyone could have done, honey." The healer gently spoke. "I'm truly sorry. But at least he went quickly, I think that's how he would have wanted it." Finn blinked hard, a memory resurfacing from the back of his mind. Then he remembered, his Poppy, Stoic the Vast, had also gone quickly. He was there 1 minute, gone the next. It wasn't fair. Why did the scum of the world live long, fulfilling lives without pain and suffering, like Ratri, and the sweetest, kindest people who wouldn't harm a fly had to suffer? Binen hadn't deserved to die. That rubble was meant to hit him besides, why hadn't Binen let things happen how they should? He's a strong kid, he could have bounced back from something like that. Why did Binen have to sacrifice himself? Why? Finn felt his father's warm hand rest on his shoulder and gently squeeze. "Binen died a hero," Finn Hiccup said as if reading his thoughts. "The others told me what happened. He wanted to protect you. He never would have lived with himself if you were hurt." Finn felt a surge of emotion bubble in his chest and he dropped his head into his hand. He tried to prevent the sob from escaping and was only partially successful. His father put both hands on his shoulders and held him steady. He thought he heard a few sniffs from around the room but none of them could be feeling the pain he was feeling. Benen had saved his life on Meru and he had saved Benen's. They'd understood the pain of slavery and weathered the after effects together. He'd been there when Benen took in his first breath of pure freedom. He'd sat beside Benen when he cried at his first full meal with their family because he'd never felt such kindness. With his own 2 hands he helped build the house Benen lived in. He and his father helped choose a sweet Gronkle to be Benen's companion. Numerous trinkets were in his room from activities they did together and countless spots on the island held memories. How could he possibly come back from this? Benen was his foundation, his rock. The foundation crumbles and the whole structure is in jeopardy. What? He couldn't even recognize his own voice. What am I supposed to do? Hiccup opened his mouth but no sound came out. He patted his son on the back again, taking several deep breaths but nothing came to him. We did everything together. It's not like I have any other friends to hang out with, not like Benen. A tone of hysteria took over the teen's voice suddenly. How ironic is that? The guy who has the best friend in the world. Hiccup walked around to face him. Finn. Last very long and every kid out there has friends that don't possibly compare. Hey. Hiccup held Finn's face gently. And I took mine for granted. No, Finn. The boy slumped into quiet sobs on Hiccup's shoulder. The father's heart broke at his son's tears and words, wishing he had something within himself to make his pain go away. Finn, you never took him for granted. Not a single day that you were with him. It's not fair. Finn wailed. I know. Hiccups forced his voice not to wobble. I know, buddy, it's not. I wish there was something wise or profound I could say to make this better but, honestly, there isn't. Is that all you can say? Finn whimpered through heavy sobs. Just, it's not fair and there's nothing I can do about it. Astrid stood from her seat at Benen's bedside and lowered herself at Hiccup's side. She kissed Finn's temple, trying to think of something, anything to say to help him. He loved you. She finally settled on saying. He'd want you to treasure his memory. But what about me? Finn sniffled and wiped his nose. I loved him. He knew that. Why'd he have to? He was so proud of you. Astrid interrupted, brushing her son's hair out of his eyes with her fingers. He always said you'd do great things one day. He had great dreams and aspirations for you. He couldn't see that great future dashed to pieces. But he's not in it. He was the reason for all that greatness. I'm nothing. Finn shook his head as he stared at the buckles on his father's vest. He wanted to see me off on my first date. He'd always tease me about girls. And he wanted. Finn's face twisted suddenly and the parents thought he'd break into another round of hysterics. He deserved better. Hiccup shook his head. He was thankful for everything. Where were you? Finn's eyes fixed on his father's with sudden intensity. Why weren't you helping with the bun? Hiccup blinked. I was coming late. Toothless and I were already on our way when. Where were you? Hiccup glanced at Astrid with a deep swallow. I took your sister to the library. Finn let out noise that almost sounded like a derisive laugh. Of course you were. Hiccup hid his frown. She deserves my time too. So Benen didn't. Finn spat. Taking your favorite to the stupid records center was more important than at least giving Benen a chance. Favorite? Hiccup sputtered. You heard me. Finn whispered in a dangerous undertone. Hiccup exhaled carefully. Finn. This is about Benen. Doesn't matter. You're never there when you're needed most. You're always off doing something. Finn. Astrid exclaimed, but the haddock boy wasn't finished. She can't even walk to the library without getting into trouble when people out there, people who need you, risk their lives for this village. But you're always blowing them off because God forbid she get hurt again. Finn. Hiccup said in a calm, level voice. That's enough. This isn't about that. It's not important, right? Not important. Finn roared, causing both his parents and even his sister to jump in alarm. My best friend is dead and you could have done something about it if you hadn't been playing favorites, and now that's not important. No, that was a poor choice of words. I'm sorry. No, you know what? That was the perfect choice of words. Finn's voice had lowered to a dangerous volume, his blue eyes icy cold. Because now I know exactly what your priorities are. Hiccup's eyebrows furrowed. Finn, how could I have known this would happen today? I'm not perfect, I can't see the future. Binnen knew that he didn't have a lot of time left anyway. Finn narrowed his eyes into slits. You don't know that. You know as well as I do that Binnen wasn't a liar. What's that supposed to mean? Finn asked. Too late, Hiccup wished he hadn't spoken. Realization dawned on his son's face. He told you something, he told you and didn't tell me. What was wrong with him? Why didn't he tell me? Finn, a calm voice came from his left and he turned his head to face Mara. You need to calm down. You. Finn seethed. Why didn't you say anything? Binnen felt not telling you, for now Mara emphasized, was best. He didn't want you to worry. Now he's gone. Finn shouted. He faced his parents and shook his head, not even glancing at his silent sister. I can't trust anybody. The only one I could trust was Binnen, and he's gone. Hiccup gasped. Finn, that's not true. No. You're the worst out of everyone. You know, for once I can actually see eye to eye with her. Finn pointed at Adriana, who jerked at being brought up. Her green eyes widened as Finn continued yelling at Hiccup. I thought you were somebody amazing. I actually thought that maybe I could look up to you like I did Poppy and I did Binnen. The boy shook his head. No, that's the ruse, isn't it? When things are good, everyone loves you. But once things go wrong, that's when the true colors show. Hiccup shook his head desperately. Finn. You might be a legend across the archipelago, but you're a terrible father. Even though she's the favorite, you can't even stick around to make her feel better about her problems. You're unreliable, you're unpredictable, you're nothing but an old fool who hides behind real heroes to make yourself look better. Astrid gasped. Finn. The damage was done. Hiccup backed up until his back hit the wall. He clamped his jaw to keep it from trembling. I'm done with you and your lies and deception and empty words. Finn bellowed, his voice echoing through the house. Hiccup swallowed. Finn stepped back toward the door. No please, not you too. The teenager took one last mournful look at Binnen before marching out the door, letting it slam against the frame. The room was completely silent as everyone stood looking at the door. Then Adriana's chair scraped against the floorboards as she stood. Mara pointed at her. Sit down, Anna. No. Adriana raised her chin defiantly before looking her father in the eyes. Hurts, doesn't it? Being abandoned. Astrid marched forward. Adriana. The girl left the room before her mother could apprehend her and the door slammed for the second time in 30 seconds. Hiccup closed his eyes and let himself slide to the floor in a heap. He buried his face in his shaking hands and tried to steady his breathing. Both of his kids hated him. Both of them, and Binnen was gone. He felt his wife's hand on his shoulder, her arms pulling him in for a hug. As he rested his head on her shoulder, he felt the wetness from his eyes soaking the fabric of her shirt. His whole body shuddered as he sat there, allowing her to stroke his hair and his back as comfortingly as she could. What could I have done, he wept. Tell me what I could have done to save him. To save any of them. You did everything you could. He heard Astrid whisper in his ear through her own tears. Not enough. Hiccup let out another choking sob and clung to her even tighter. Never enough. Sure. Astrid hushed him, unable to think of a response. Just let it out. And let it out he did. Hiccup's hoarse sobs were the only noises in the room for what felt like hours. Mara had gone to tend to another patient, leaving the Haddocks alone. Hiccup felt like his whole heart had burst open. He had failed his daughter, his son, his dear friend, his village, he had failed everyone. Why Benen. Hiccup whimpered into his wife's shoulder. Why now? Why? He felt his wife shakily crying against him and hung on tighter. One thing they both knew without a shadow of a doubt, nothing would ever be the same after this. Chapter 19, The Flame. Chapter text. Finn blinked awake early the next morning, vaguely aware of his surroundings. His whole mind seemed to be singularly focused on the horrible nightmares that had plagued him the whole night, some of Rattray and his cane, others of his best friend dead in a pool of his own blood. The Haddock boy immediately got out of his bed and began throwing on his clothes as quickly as he could. Only one person would know why he was suddenly inundated with horrific images and a constant feeling of powerlessness. It was as Finn was pounding down the stairs, not bothering to keep quiet, that he suddenly stopped, a horrible sinking feeling in his gut. Benen wasn't going to be at home. The nightmares of his best friend lying dead in his own blood were more than just nightmares. The boy slowly lowered himself until he was sitting down on the step. He placed his head in his hands and took several deep breaths, forcing himself not to lose it right there, not to let out the wail he felt deep within his soul. He didn't realize how long he was sitting there until he heard footsteps just behind his head. He looked up to see his sister descending the staircase, still dressed in her long pink nightgown and fuzzy, yak fur slippers. She sat down next to him on the stair, her blonde head several inches below his own. Ordinarily he would have thought it funny how small she was compared to him, but he couldn't get Benen out of his head. Adriana was quiet for a few seconds before speaking up. I know what loneliness feels like. So if you need someone to talk to. Anna, I'm not you. And I'm not a girl. Finn suddenly snapped, taken aback at how hoarse his voice sounded. He sighed deeply when his sister flinched slightly. He knew it wasn't fair to take this out on her when she was on his side for once. He mentally reminded himself that she had loved Benen almost as much as he had before speaking again. I just, don't act like the wise guy here because suddenly I'm feeling something. Okay. I'm not. No, I know you're just trying to help, but honestly you're no different than anyone. Same empty words whether intended or not, the words don't help. The promises don't do anything. The wisdom from people doesn't make you feel warm and fuzzy. You should understand that more than anyone. Finn said as patiently as he could before standing up and going back upstairs. Adriana remained seated on the stair, watching him ascend the staircase and walk back into his room, shutting the door behind him. A part of her felt like she should have been offended by his words, but something about his voice surprised her. For a long time, she thought he was oblivious to things like feelings and emotional pain, but he wasn't. She wasn't sure whether or not to be glad he finally understood a little bit of her own struggle. Was she supposed to feel anything except sorry for him? Still feeling conflicted, the Haddock girl got to her feet and headed to the kitchen to make herself some breakfast. She would have to think about her brother's emotions some other time. If Finn had been able to focus on his surroundings, he would have been touched that so many people showed up for Benen's funeral that afternoon. The crowd was so thick, he was glad he'd been leading it because he certainly wouldn't have been able to see Benen's ship otherwise. The silent crowd watched as Finn got to his knees next to the small ship to inspect it, making sure that it was perfect before shoving off. A few trinkets lined the body, which was covered in a thin white sheet. Finn recognized a small wooden carving he had made his friend a few weeks after they'd gotten back from Mayro. He wanted to thank whoever had thought to include it, but he suspected it might be his father. He wasn't ready to talk to him again. Finn cleared his throat, speaking in a low voice so that no one could hear except Benen. I'm not so good at this, last words. Finn bit his lip, his heart drumming against his ribs. What could he possibly say to sum up the best 6.5 years of his life? To convey how close he and Benen had been, how much he had loved him. There were no words. Nothing profound or important. Nothing at all. I wish I could say something amazing that'll make you proud, but all I can say is that I'll miss you. More than anything. Finn straightened up and nodded to his father. Hiccup shoved the ship out to sea and, aside from the gentle lapping of the small waves on the shore, there was absolute silence. Finn stood rigid, bow and arrow in hand and waiting for the ship to get far enough away from the shore to burn safely without igniting anything else. A small part of him wanted to chase it down and give Benen a few more final words, but he couldn't think of anything else to say. He tightened his jaw as Benen's ship sailed farther and farther out. Hiccup placed a hand on his shoulder when it had sailed out far enough and gestured to the small fire beneath them. The haddock boy shakily reached down and ignited the tip of the arrow. As he pulled it back, his hand coming to rest beside his head, Finn stopped. His hands were shaking too hard. If he let go, the arrow probably wouldn't even travel 2 feet. Small, warm hands rested on his and he looked over to see his sister standing beside him, silent tears streaming down her face. Almost without thinking, he let go. The flame traveled in a high arc through the air before landing directly on target. The cloudy sky was suddenly filled with flames propelled forward, all hitting the ship and igniting it so that it almost looked like the sun had come out again. Finn watched as the sky almost turned to fire, several of the dragons paying their respects alongside the Vikings, and dearly wished Benen could have seen this. He would have been overwhelmed with gratitude. He probably would have shed a few happy tears. Finn fought off the crazy urge to smile at the thought. The face of his best friend, wiping tears out of those sky-blue eyes, filled him with an ache he could hardly endure. There was a flicker of happiness in there somewhere, but it was stifled by the agonizing pain that plagued him every second since his friend had died. Finn silently watched the ship burn until it sank and only a few clouds of smoke remained. He turned around and was slightly surprised to see most of the crowd still standing behind him. Of all people, his mother was absent, as were the Larsens and several families with small children. But the rest of them still gazed out over the sea and watched as the clouds of smoke finally dissipated. Finn knew it was time for a quick lunch before they all would meet in the Great Hall for the rest of the service. His father wanted to gather everyone together to share stories about Benen. Finn knew he had to go, there was no way he would miss out on such a vital part of honoring his best friend, but he dreaded it so much his stomach ached. He didn't know if he could stand listening to all the amazing things Benen had done. Because there was no summing up his elderly friend's life in a short period of time, no way of expressing just how amazing and how admirable he had been. Finn dragged his feet on the way to the Great Hall, falling behind the crowd. He saw someone out of the corner of his eye walking beside him, and it took several seconds before he felt like turning to see who it was. Adriana walked in silence with him for a while, still wiping tears out of her eyes. Finn used to joke about how often she would cry, sometimes over the silliest things, but this time he was almost thankful for her tears. Thankful that someone was responding the appropriate way when he himself couldn't figure out how to react or emote at all. His sister didn't speak until they had reached the entrance to the Great Hall. They stood in front of it for a few seconds before turning to face each other. And then Finn did something even he didn't expect. He stepped forward and placed his arms around her. She was taken aback at this sudden affection, but she held him tightly. It was at least a minute before Finn finally broke away, wiping his eyes and blinking to prevent any future tears. Don't get used to that," he said shakily as he straightened up and determinedly fixed his eyes on his feet. Adriana gave him a tiny smile. "Never." As Finn opened the door, she spoke up again. "Finn. The haddock girl sighed deeply before looking him directly in the eye. "Love you." Finn felt his throat constrict, but he dry swallowed and nodded. "You too, Anna." Cold. Empty. Alone. That's the only way Eric could describe what he felt. A cacophony of words continuously flitted through his mind, unwilling to give him rest or peace with what had happened. There was only a dull ache in the pit of his stomach, a heavy weight on his shoulders that wouldn't ease, a tear in his soul so wide and deep that nothing in the world could heal. Except time. That's what everyone had said. Give it time, they'd said almost mechanically, as if it would stop the grief, as if it would stop the pain. Nothing could heal this. The loss of someone so close, so special, so vital. Nothing could fill a crater so vast. Hiccup and Magnus were the only two who'd held him in their arms for an extended time. With Magnus, he'd cried. It had just happened. With Hiccup, he'd merely stood in his friend's arms and buried his face in his shoulder, unblinking, uncaring of anything else going on around them. Hiccup had grasped his shoulders and nearly in tears apologized that they hadn't gotten home in time. But Eric wasn't angry with him. No, he was angry with the one person who'd sworn to bring back the cure, and had failed. He was angry with the girl who claimed they were best friends and said she'd do anything to help him, as any best friend would. He felt cheated, used by someone who didn't know what she was talking about. If that's what having a best friend meant, then he'd rather be alone. Making empty promises was too painful. Too costly. No one had talked to him in hours and he was okay with that. Benen's funeral had been that afternoon. It made him think of his father's funeral only a few days before. Hiccup had given his father a funeral worthy of a king, and deep down he was grateful. But he'd only accepted a soft pat on the back before walking blankly away from the crowds to be alone, ignoring the pitying expressions cast his way. He didn't need their pity or their comfort. He didn't want it. And now he found himself walking away from yet another funeral. He walked until he found himself sitting by the cliffside beyond the forge. He couldn't remember when he'd sat down or drew up his knees to his chest or rested his chin against his knees. He could vaguely hear the waves crashing against the rocks below and the seagulls squawking overhead. All around him was quiet. Eric couldn't remember when he'd cried last. He'd cried with Magnus and Gregory until he pulled himself out of their arms, forcing the tears to stop and walking away from the scene. He'd stepped outside the hole to calm himself, tell himself it was just a bad dream, his father was okay, he was just sleeping as he had been for the past days. But upon returning, he found Mara pulling a white sheet over his father's prone form. He watched his father's face disappear from view. He'd cracked, slumping against a bench and shutting out any attempts of comfort by his family. At some point he'd cried himself to sleep, exhaustion charting its own course. And he'd woken to Hiccup and Astrid's echoing whispers about Adriana's problems. Anger swelled in his chest a mite, but was quickly extinguished by grief's cold fingers. Benen's death had brought back all the emotions he thought he'd pushed down. Benen had been an old man who was ready for death, but Eric never would have thought his own father would leave him so early. He wouldn't be there when he came of age and was allowed to participate in village meetings. He wouldn't be there for his wedding day and wouldn't meet his grandchildren. Despair clawed at his insides and he choked it down by digging his nails into his arms, forcing himself to remain placid. He had to keep it together. He had to beat this, he was better than this. Soft footfalls sounded behind him and he heard the swish of material. Eric forced himself not to care as someone sat down beside him. He expected Magnus or Aud, a small part of him wished it was his mother, but he knew she'd enclosed herself in the house as soon as the funeral was over, even if he'd left before she did. Out of the corner of his eye he could see blonde hair. Maybe it was Adriana. If it was, he'd surely lose it, but no, he could tell by the woman's size that she was bigger than Adriana. So who? I'm so sorry, Eric. For the first time in countless hours, Eric showed emotion, surprise. His neck made a crick sound that only he heard as he turned and saw Astrid sitting beside him. Her braid was loose and wispy, her skin still a bit clammy and her eyes dark with grief of her own. The breeze was biting against her skin, he could tell from the goosebumps racing up her arms. He finally realized how cold he was at the observation, but made no move to stand or warm himself up. He didn't care. He only continued to stare at her in surprise. Of all the people who'd come. I hate this. So many goodbyes. We never wanted this to happen, least of all to your family. Astrid murmured. And I know things have fallen apart with you and Audrey, but if you ever want to come over and talk to either me or Hiccup, don't hesitate. You're always welcome in our home. Eric blinked unresponsively and she pressed, you know that, don't you? The teenager dry swallowed before turning his eyes back to the cliff. He heard Astrid sigh softly to herself, figuring that she was wishing she could do something for him. He wanted to tell her to go away, to not try because nothing would help. But he couldn't open his mouth to speak. Eric, honey. Eric heard her scoot closer to him and almost instantly felt the warmth she brought when her knees touched his ankle. I don't want to say what everyone says, you do need time. But don't shut us out. There are people that are here for you, who want to help you. When you're ready, give yourself a chance. That's all I ask. Astrid rested a searing hand on his shoulder blade and he blinked, a small frown forming on his face. You are loved and we've got you. That's what he said. Astrid blinked, shocked just as much as he was that he'd spoken. Eric mentally frowned at how terrible he sounded but didn't try to fix it. He didn't care. What? Astrid asked gently. Eric heard himself respond, the last night. He woke up and we talked. Astrid smiled a little. So you got to talk to him, that's good. Except he lied. His vocal cords constricted painfully. He finally cleared his throat. Lied. Yeah, Eric looked down at his boots. The last thing he ever said to me was, "Come here, son. I've got you." He said that and he left. He clenched his jaw, swallowing hard as suddenly his eyes burned and he felt the desperation welling up again. He shook his head and jerked to stand, his limbs creaking from misuse and cold. Astrid stared up at him with dread in her eyes as he bit out in a wobbly voice, "Don't make me promises you can't keep. I've lost 2 for 2 in the past week, 3 if you want to count Binnen. I don't need more grief." Eric turned on his heel and stalked back to the village, even as Astrid stood and called after him. He ignored her. The cold burned his lungs as he tried to calm the storm rising in his chest. The pain burned his soul like he'd swallowed a hot coal from the forge. The heat stung his eyes, making him blink rapidly to steady his emotions. He found himself running to his house long before he knew it, throwing open the door and charging up the stairs before anyone could say a word to him. He slammed his door shut and locked it, panting and eyes darting around his bedroom for some sort of relief. Something to stem the throbbing wound in his chest, anything to ease the pain. All around him were memories of his father, pictures he'd drawn as a child, rocks they'd collected over the years, his first works in the leather shop. Everything from the quilt on his bed to the drop of white paint on his boots from painting the barn that past summer, everything had a memory. And every memory increased his agony. "No, no, Dad!" Eric cried out, slumping to the floor with his hands in his hair. "Dad! Dad!" The tears finally rained down his face and he curled into himself, begging to every god he knew to help him. "Come back. Daddy, please come back to me, I need you." If anyone heard him, he didn't care. Not his mother, not Magnus, not Gregory or Aud, not even Charger. No one could help this. He was truly alone. The fire in his soul burned and flamed no matter how hard he sobbed into his hands or his shoulders shook. The only thing he knew was grief and pain and the ever-burning flame within. Long after the day turned to night and his face felt crisp with dried tears, he heard the soft rap of knuckles on the door over his head. "Eric. Magnus." She sounded exhausted. "Can I come in?" Some small part of his soul wanted to reach out and accept her help, her love. But in the end, grief won. He didn't want her to come in. He didn't want her help. He wanted to be alone. "Eric, please." He couldn't even stir up the energy to ask her to leave him alone. He felt drained of all feeling and emotion and energy. Eventually he heard her footfalls as she retreated to the downstairs. Time. They said time was the answer. Time had no meaning anymore. Only pain. Only grief. Only the flame. Finn had thought he could handle the second part of Binen's service. He thought he could listen to all the stories about Binen and smile, remembering all the memories they had together with the same sort of fondness he had for his memories with his Poppy. He had been wrong. Only 30 minutes had passed before Finn couldn't take it any longer. Abruptly he stood from his seat and walked to the door as quickly as he could, the beloved necklace Binen had given him clutched in his hand the entire way. Though he really didn't care, he was glad he had sat toward the back of the hall. Fewer people looked his way when he stood. But he didn't have to look to know his parents were watching. He could almost feel their eyes burning through the back of his head. He forced himself not to care as he shoved the mighty doors open and stepped out into the cold. It was windier than it had been and the force of the cold blew his hair back to the root. He stood there trying to control his heavy breathing and the sudden chills coursing through his body, but despite these distractions he couldn't stop the rising panic. Binen was gone. He was really, truly gone. The boy couldn't understand how kept possibly forgetting it. He would be thinking about the accident and the fear and the blood until he'd jump up and march out with the intention to talk to his best friend because he always made things better. Binen made him calm, made him see the opposite side of things that made him upset. Binnen had always been the answer to every problem, every qualm, quarrel, and question. Finn could hear the sound of his blood pulsing in his ears even over the howling wind. Who could he talk to? What could anyone say that could help? He didn't realize he was running until he missed a step and slipped, tumbling headlong into a snowbank. He vaguely wondered in his panic how he'd gotten down the stone steps so quickly, but it didn't matter. He had to get away from the houses filled with happy families, the fake sympathetic smiles, the hollow looks of grieving villagers who'd also lost someone. He couldn't stand to be around his depressed family any longer because they couldn't help him. Nobody could. The haddock boy felt a branch slap his face, probably cutting his cheek, but he kept going. He didn't know where he was going and he didn't care. It didn't matter. The snow swirled around him as he dodged trees, bushes, and boulders in the dark. It wasn't until he tripped on a sharp stone and skidded to a stop that he stopped and took in his surroundings. The cemetery. Finn backed up on his hands and feet, willing himself to get up. But the ground was slippery and his body gasped for air from his sudden trek. He looked around, willing himself to calm down. Of all the places he had to run, why hadn't he run somewhere comforting? The gods must hate him. But then a larger tombstone caught his eye from the back corner. As if his feet had a mind of their own, he shakily stood and walked toward it. His vision swam for a moment and he growled in irritation at the after effects from the sickness. He blinked long and hard, willing the world to stop dancing. Eventually he made it over to the grave and he slid to his knees. "Poppy," Finn said plainly. His voice was hollow and his breath fogged in front of his face. He hadn't visited Poppy's grave since his nana died. He thought about the day his parents told him his Poppy had died and he felt the same desperate pain in his chest. Except this was worse because he was older. This time, he understood what death was and just how cruel it could be. Thick, hot tears poured down his face and he leaned his forehead against the stone. "Poppy, what am I supposed to do? Tell me what to do. I feel so alone." Finn couldn't remember the last time he'd felt so alone. Never before had he been reduced to sobbing on his grandfather's grave, but every kid has fits of loneliness now and then. Every memory that came to mind had Binnen's hand in it, even if they hadn't been doing anything. A simple hello as they passed each other on the street was enough to make his day. Binnen had touched his heart in every way imaginable and there was no denying it or getting around it. He simply couldn't wish for Binnen to cease to exist in his mind. He couldn't wish to be struck with amnesia to make the pain go away. Something niggled in the back of his mind like an old memory resurfacing. As if he was reliving the past, he touched the hidden slave mark under his hair beside his left ear. They hadn't been home long, a week perhaps. They'd returned from Mayro and gotten Binnen established in their Poppy's old home, which had sat dormant for many years. He remembered sitting at the table while Binnen walked to and fro dusting and wiping shelves and sweeping. No amount of prodding could convince the elderly man to sit down and rest. "Why would I sit and rest while I'm blessed with a home to clean?" Finn scoffed. "You're hopeless." Binnen smiled widely at the 7-year-old boy and continued his work. The boy was impetuous and snooky for one so young, and being free from Rattri's clutches only encouraged such behavior. Binnen firmly believed he would have lots of work to do for many years to come with this one. Good, strong hands can do much hard work. But you know what they say, many hands make hard work light. Finn raised an eyebrow at the man, making him chuckle. "Do you always speak in riddles?" "Not always." The old man's blue eyes twinkled. "I suspect I speak in riddles more when I'm excited. And backwards." What? The two stared at each other in confusion before they burst into laughter. Binnen leaned against a pole and sighed heavily, wiping his brow. "I haven't laughed like that in many years." Finn sculled. "Not even allowed to laugh?" Binnen shrugged. "I believe laughter from a slave would make the master suspicious. The occasional slave will become rebellious and pull a prank on his master. The consequences for such crimes were..." The elderly man waved his hand to dismiss the topic. "No matter. Here I can laugh freely and I will do so as much as I can." Benen swept for a few moments longer until he really noticed the silence. Finn hadn't replied like usual. He turned to see Finn leaning against one elbow and his other hand gently scratching beside his left ear. The elderly man smiled sympathetically. I remember when my scar itched. Most annoying thing that's ever crossed my body, I think. The boy's eyes curiously searched Benen's head for a scar, but he found none. Where's yours? Oh, under here. Benen patted his breast right over his heart. Yours is a burn mark, so it will take less time to heal. It should stop bothering you soon. Finn frowned. What's yours? A tattoo. But no matter, we need not discuss such things anymore. Finn's face fell and Benen stopped, curious. Unless there's something you want to talk about. No, yes. The boy huffed. Benen set his broom aside and sat down in the chair adjacent to Finn. What's bothering you? Finn stubbornly stared at the wood grain table, his fingers tracing the grooves and random shapes. His foot tapped against the floor beneath the table. But he made no moves or sounds to reply. Benen had learned early on just how stubborn this strong little man was. As soon as he moved to Berk and met his entire family, he really understood. Stubbornness was not only in his blood, but also in his nature. It was practically instinct to refuse to comply. Luckily, he was a patient man. His only problem, he was still learning about the boy. How far could he push? How far should he push? You know what the hardest thing for me has been all these years? Benen asked presently. Finn blinked, but he could tell the boy was listening. Not having anyone to talk to. Loneliness. This life is a hard and lonely road for someone who has no friends to share it with. He cocked his head to see eye to eye with Finn, and finally blue eyes met blue. We're friends, right? Finn nodded instantly, as if this were the most ridiculous question to have ever graced his ears. Then I will always be here to listen, Finn. It takes two to converse. It's only up to you if you want to talk. All you have to do is speak. Benen smiled and patted the boy's hand, moving to stand. He hoped the boy would mull over his words for a while and come around over time. Finn spoke before he could fully stand. I still see him. Benen relaxed back in his chair with a confused face. Him. Finn looked away in shame. Ratri. Ah. Benen nodded. I. Finn licked his lips. I don't think about him. I try to ignore all that happened. But after I go to bed, I have bad dreams. He stands over me, hitting me, and he won't stop. Finn slumped further into his seat. To his horror, tears were beginning to burn his eyes. I wake up all shaky and sweaty, and I can't go back to sleep. The tears spilled onto his cheeks. Finn, completely embarrassed to be crying in front of someone he really didn't know very well, hid his face in his hands as he desperately tried to stem the flow. I don't know what to do, Benen. I can't talk to anyone, nobody knows what that's like. Hey now, it's all right. Benen held the boy's shoulders gently. He frowned sadly at the little boy trying so hard not to show emotion. Finn, don't hold it in. You're still young, you have the right to feel. Especially about something like that. The boy sniffed once more, tears still flowing down his cheeks, and the elderly man smiled gently. Come here. Finn instantly buried his face in the man's shoulder. Benen hated how the strong boy in his arms shook like a leaf in a tempest. He took a slow deep breath. I know pain and suffering better than anyone. I've had a very long, very hard life. But I forced myself to believe in those especially hard times that something good would come of it someday. And it was true. Here I am now, thanks to you. Finn swallowed thickly. You make it sound easy because you're old. Benen laughed and tousled the boy's hair. We mature with the damage, Finn. Not with the years. Finn stared at the old man for a few moments before nearly crushing him in a hug. Benen jumped in surprise but smiled widely, hugging him back. Things will be all right someday, Finn. I guarantee it. Yes, no matter how long it would take, if it took until the last day of his life, he'd be sure the boy would be fine. Just fine. An owl hooted over his head somewhere, jerking Finn out of his reverie. His forehead felt like it had frosted into his grandfather's gravestone. The tears had practically turned to ice on his cheeks. He felt dead and cold both on the inside and out. A small part of him wondered how long it had been, but he forced himself not to care. Against his will, he shivered against the cold. His rapid sprint this far into the woods winded him and he could feel his throat tighten with every dry swallow. Mara would not be pleased. Too bad he was too far gone to care. Thoughts of his warm bed at home nearly pulled him out of his stupor, but he didn't move. The thought of facing his family, even walking through the same room to get up the stairs to his own little sanctuary, was enough to keep him rooted to the ground. He could almost feel his formerly strong will bending. He didn't want to go home. He didn't want to stand up. A small, selfish part of him just wanted to freeze to death out here. Maybe the ice could dull the pain. Without restraint, he closed his eyes and blocked out the world around him. Toothless warbled over his shoulder for his human to hurry up before trotting further into the trees. Hiccup shoved his hands into his pockets, keeping a wary eye out for his son in all directions. Toothless had easily gotten a scent from outside the great hole and so far they'd followed it for nearly a mile into the woods. Where had his little man gone? Hiccup's prosthetic slipped on a hidden rock and his knee buckled. He just managed to catch himself before ramming his knee. He huffed in mild irritation and stood back up. If his leg gave out on him now, he'd tear his hair out. That's the last thing he needed right now. He had to find Finn and try to talk to him. They hadn't spoken a single word since Finn's blow-up the previous evening. The father tried everything in his power to not hold a grudge against his son for his angry, hurtful words, easier said than done. Adriana had also shut him out completely. He wondered how long he could survive without his children's attention. Once again, he thanked the gods for Astrid and her faithfulness. Without her, no need to entertain those kinds of thoughts. Things were bad enough as it was. Toothless sniffed the ground and then the air. Finally he barked with a nod of his head to their left. They continued on the random path with heavy hearts. Hiccup couldn't honestly believe Benen was gone. Olaf had been a hard blow, it was hard to consider who could possibly replace such a great man and asset in the council. He feared he'd have to search long and hard for someone as wise as Olaf. But Benen, there was no replacing Benen. It was simply impossible for such a kind, loving being like him to be replicated. Toothless finally led him into a small clearing and Hiccup stopped in surprise. The cemetery. Why had Finn come here of all places? The father shook his head and walked past the first of the tombstones. It didn't matter why. Nothing makes sense when you're grieving. Toothless bounded ahead of him suddenly and before looking, Hiccup knew exactly where he was going. In the back corner of the cemetery were his parents' graves, and curled up against his father's was Finn. The Night Fury sniffed and nuzzled the boy's hair, growling when he didn't respond. Hiccup blinked out of his trance and knelt down in front of his son. Resting his hand against Finn's forehead, he frowned at the chill he felt, but was pleased to see him hum softly in response to the warmth. Hiccup sighed softly, pausing to gaze at both his parents' graves. I could use some great wisdom right about now. Anything to tell me what to do. At least to help my son, either of my kids. I feel so useless. He frowned at the snow like it had uttered the distasteful word. His mother had hated the word. He sighed again and looked at his son. Unfortunately for both of us, buddy, dead men don't speak. The chief turned toward Toothless and slid his saddlebags back to create more room. Gently he prodded Finn until he seemed partially semi-conscious. He expected the boy to at least argue, but Finn instead rested his forehead against his father's chest. With that response, Hiccup knew his son needed to get warm quickly. When Hiccup had Finn carefully strapped into the saddle in the front seat, he told Toothless to take off. Let's go home, bud. Finn didn't make a sound or movement as the cemetery grew smaller below them. There you go, lassie. Gobber smiled toothily at Adriana as he handed her a rather large mug of tea. Despite its size, she accepted it and was rather surprised to note it tasted pretty good. Thanks, Gobber. I didn't know you made tea. Gobber sat down at the stool beside her, sending a short sympathetic gaze to the silent Astrid sitting at the head of the table with her hands wrapped around her own mug. Oh yeah, I can make lots of good teas, like chamomile, peppermint, green tea. The door suddenly opened in a whirlwind of snowflakes. Hiccup stepped inside first with Toothless at his heels, and Finn draped across the saddle, clearly unconscious. Astrid nearly spilled her tea when she jumped up. "Finn. Relax, he's just sleeping." Hiccup unbuckled a few of the straps and pointed at the upstairs for Toothless to take him up. Astrid followed the Night Fury upstairs to help get her son to bed. Hiccup removed his coat, staring at the floorboards, the walls, his shoe, anywhere but the table where his daughter sat. He had a vague feeling she stared at him while sipping her monstrous cup of tea. But honestly, her words from yesterday still stung even after he'd tried so very hard to make amends. It hurt like nobody's business to be scorned and unforgiven when that's all he wanted, forgiveness. "Are you just going to stare at your coat all night?" "Sorry Gobber," Hiccup apologized, turning toward the kitchen. Gobber watched him pour hot water into a mug and stare at it for another few minutes. Adriana swirled her tea around, acting as if she didn't have a care in the world that her father was also grieving. She shouldn't fuel the fire, but he wasn't about to lecture her. So Gobber broke the silence again, raising his mead. "Where was he?" Hiccup flinched. "The cemetery." Adriana promptly stood. "Thanks for the tea, Gobber." "Oh, hold on, lass." Adriana ignored the old smith and continued up the stairs. Apparently there would be no talk of cemeteries while she was around. Neither man moved until they heard the sound of her door closing, then Hiccup covered his eyes with his hand. Gobber watched him swallow hard and lean fully against the counter. Astrid closed Finn's door and came down the stairs. She noticed Hiccup beginning to pull on his hair and was at his side within seconds. "Hey, it's okay, come here." Hiccup turned and buried his face in her shoulder. Gobber watched on sadly. He remembered the day Hiccup became chief. It was supposed to be an exciting day when it finally came. But it came so suddenly and so unexpectedly that the young man had been thrown into harsh leadership roles and high-stress situations with no time to grieve for the passing of his own father. Now Hiccup looked the same as he did then. Unsure, confused, lost. A chief had to hold up for his people, but inside his own home, he had to let the walls down. He had to feel or there would be consequences later on. Hiccup sat up and wiped the few tears off his face. I don't know what to do. Addie won't give me a chance, and Finn. I don't even know where to start. Give him time." The couple turned towards Gobber and he continued, "Finn will need time to grieve. Lots and lots of time. He won't get over this easily. Mom, he's naturally closer to you, always has been. Don't cling to him, but always be there for him. He'll come to you first, no doubt." Astrid nodded, her face hard in determination. Hiccup. Gobber sighed. "The boy's just angry. Both of them are. They're angry, they're lost and confused. Finn's stubborn and Adriana's stubborn and tougher than she looks. They got both of those things from you, so you need to do the same. Give them time and space, but don't back down. They'll come around eventually." Hiccup sighed heavily with a nod. His eyes were red and puffy from both crying and lack of sleep. "Any other advice?" "Not for today." "Well, except get some sleep. You're going to need it." Gobber stood and hobbled over to give each of them a hug, which they appreciated. They saw him to the door and bid him goodbye when he left. Astrid turned to her husband after he closed the door, waiting for him to make eye contact. He finally did, and she gave him a small smile. "Just another storm," he nodded. "We've weathered some pretty bad ones. We can beat this too. We just have to remember Binnen." "But Gobber's right, the kids will come around." She held his face in her hands when he didn't make eye contact. "They will." Hiccup exhaled and kissed her forehead gently. "For both our sakes, I hope so." Chapter 20, Weakness. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. In the wake of a tragedy, sometimes it can be almost unnerving how fast people tended to move on. But to those the tragedy affected the most, moving on seemed to be an impossible feat. Finn was a prime example. For weeks, he shut himself in his room, not even coming down for meals. On the rare occasions he did come downstairs, he was sullen and moody. But Hiccup and Astrid couldn't figure out what to do with him, and anything they tried only seemed to make it worse. Mara was over periodically to make sure Finn wasn't wasting away completely. But soon her sights were set on someone else entirely. Hiccup, she said firmly as she descended the staircase yet again, if you don't start taking care of yourself, you'll be the next to go. What? Hiccup exclaimed, nearly knocking over his bowl of porridge in surprise. You heard me. The healer crossed her arms and fixed him with a steel-grey gaze that would make a stronger man than him run away in fear. You haven't slept at all since Binnen died, have you? Well, yeah, of course I. No. Astrid interrupted impatiently. He's dozed off here and there but he won't relax. Hiccup gave his wife an exasperated gaze made only more pathetic by the dark circles under his eyes. Mara cleared her throat loudly so that he would turn back to her. Right then she said in a brisk voice, you need to get to bed. I'm sure your wife can handle your duties for the day. Mara. No arguments. I won't have you dropping dead from exhaustion. There's been enough tragedy. Mara insisted. Go upstairs, draw the curtains, and get some sleep. Astrid almost smiled at the chastised look on her husband's face as he obeyed the healer's orders. He looked like a child being punished for something. Mara, satisfied that the chief had done what she'd told him, turned to the Haddock matriarch with a frown. As for Finn, he needs to eat more, she said in a slightly softer voice. He's already started losing weight. I've tried. Astrid sighed deeply, placing her head in her hands. I take food up to him 3 times a day but he just nibbles at it no matter what I say. Grief is a difficult process. Mara put on her coat as she spoke. And goodness knows he's going to need some more time. But he needs to keep up his strength. I know. Astrid mumbled. But with him and Hiccup and Adri never being at home. Mara paused as she was adjusting her coat. Slowly, she sauntered forward and sat down next to the frazzled woman, who still didn't look up. I know things are difficult now, she said softly. But you'll get through it. You always do. She smiled slightly at the words she knew were probably empty. I know that's what everyone says. But I've watched you and Hiccup weather storm after storm. This one really is no different. I know. Astrid sniffled and did her best not to cry. There had been enough crying in the Haddock house over the last few weeks. Easier said than done. I know. Mara replied, patting the woman on the arm. But if you need someone to talk to, my door's always open. Thank you. Astrid looked up and gave her a small smile. I really appreciate your patience. It's all part of the job. Mara gave her one last consoling pat on the arm before straightening up. Now don't let Hiccup go to work today and make sure he sleeps until he starts to look almost human again. Astrid chuckled appreciatively at this. And please don't let Finn lose any more weight. He'll waste away into nothing if he doesn't start eating properly. Astrid nodded and watched as Mara let herself out, braving the freezing cold outside and shutting the door behind her rather forcefully. In the silence that followed, the former Horferson thought about everything her family had gone through in the last decade. First with Adriana's kidnapping, then Stoic's sudden death, then the duel that nearly killed her husband, then her own marital issues, then Finn's enslavement. Life hadn't been easy for the family and she had a strong feeling that the next decade would bring with it many more problems to face and storms to endure. But as she mulled it over, she realized that she had matured a little bit with each difficulty her family had faced. She had learned to protect her children at all costs when her daughter had been taken. She had learned to cherish every moment she had with her family when her husband nearly died at Dager's hand. She had learned patience with different learning styles through her struggles with Adriana and patience with different coping mechanisms through her struggles with Hiccup. And, of course, she had learned to pay closer attention to the problems plaguing her young ones when Finn had run away and nearly been lost to them forever. Each new challenge brought with it something to be learned. Astrid knew this would be no different. But as she sat in the complete silence of her home, knowing full well that her daughter wouldn't be home for hours and her boys were both probably lying down and trying not to allow their dark thoughts to consume them, she wasn't sure what to do next. Adriana had never spent so much time at the library. Matilda had been rather pleased for the first few days before concern for the girl's well-being began to take over. The Haddock girl hardly ever spoke at all in her long hours of reading. She devoured one book after another until Matilda was beginning to think that she would run out of reading material. In fact, the only times Adriana wasn't in the corner reading were for meals or when she was doing the random jobs she got around town watching other people's children while they did errands or got some much-needed time alone with their spouses. The girl had always been a quiet presence in the library but never to this extent. Adriana, Matilda said softly after a few weeks of this behavior, if you need to talk to someone, you know I'm happy to listen. Why would I need to talk to someone? Adriana asked, not looking up from her book. It's just, you've been here every day for weeks and I thought. I'm fine, the girl interrupted. Really? Lily, who was snoozing just behind her, gave Matilda a sad sort of coo that seemed to contradict her human's words. Matilda sighed and, deciding that Adriana was old enough to make these sort of decisions herself, walked to the other end of the library to reorganize one of the shelves. Adriana, on the other hand, was now thoroughly distracted from her reading. The truth was that she did need to talk to someone, but Matilda, despite her efforts, simply wasn't the right person. She missed Eric so badly, she felt a constant ache in the pit of her stomach. But he still wouldn't speak to her and, honestly, she didn't blame him. So who could she talk to? Wasn't there one person her age who would be willing to listen to what she had to? The answer came to her so quickly, she almost dropped her book. Of course. How had she forgotten? Well, he might not be interested in her issues with Eric, but at least he was upbeat and could make her smile. That had to count for something, right? The Haddock girl wasted no time in hurrying over to a desk and pulling out a few sheets of parchment and a piece of charcoal. It had been a long time since she had written a letter to anyone outside of Burke, but she knew Nyssa would have no trouble finding her intended recipient. After pausing a moment with her charcoal over the parchment, Adriana began to write. Mara had been right. She was always right. Hiccup awoke from his slumber feeling much better than he had in weeks. He rubbed his eyes, which felt much less baggy than before, and stretched before practically hopping out of bed to begin the day. Astrid, who was still half asleep beside him, moaned and rolled over, falling back to sleep instantly. Feeling like he might as well continue in this pattern of taking care of himself, Hiccup dressed, ate a quick breakfast, and left for work. As he walked through town, he thought about his village and just how much rebuilding was still left. The physical projects were nearly finished, a few minor structures still needed some work but they could wait. But the forlorn expressions on some of his people's faces weren't easy to ignore. Hiccup had a feeling that he'd be doing a lot of comforting in the months to come. It was enough to make him wish his father were still around. Not that Stoic was very good at anything involving feelings, but the responsibility was enormous and Hiccup, despite his age, still felt like a kid when things like this happened. He felt like there was nothing he could do to make it better, no matter how much he wished there were. Stoic had made this look so easy. It was as Hiccup was mulling over his childhood and watching his father do his chiefly duties that he nearly ran headlong into a very exhausted-looking Gobber. "Watch where you're going!" Gobber exclaimed grumpily. "Nearly impaled you. You're lucky I hadn't sharpened this yet." He held up a sword. "Sorry." Hiccup held up his hands apologetically. "You okay? You look frazzled. Caught on, have you?" Gobber smiled and shook his head. "I didn't mean to snap at you. I've been falling behind. Not as young as I used to be." "Oh. Do you need some help?" Hiccup offered, falling in step with his former mentor on the way to the forge. "I always need help. Been doing okay since you left, but these old muscles are starting to slow down. Can't do as much in a day as I used to." Gobber sighed. "Sounds like you need an apprentice," Hiccup remarked. He suddenly stopped and stood rigid to the spot, his mouth slightly agape. And then his face broke into a smile. "Finn. You really are losing it." Gobber chortled. "I'm Gobber, remember?" No, Finn. My son." "Yes, I am familiar with the lad." "No, I mean Finn could be your apprentice." Hiccup slapped a hand to his forehead, instantly regretting this action when a stinging sensation exploded in his palm. "Gobber, please, he needs something to do. We can't stand him, walking around aimlessly and staring at the walls anymore. He needs something to do that will help him. I don't know, help him with something." Please Gobber. Hiccup. Gobber placed his remaining hand on his former apprentice's shoulder. I've needed an apprentice for a good, long time now. Of course, if he's willing. I'll ask him as soon as I can. Hiccup sighed in relief. This will be good for him. Make some money, do some work, he's always happiest when he's got something to do. I'd think he'd do just fine. Hey, where are you going? Gobber called after Hiccup's retreating back. The sooner I get him out of the house the better. Hiccup called. Thanks, Gobber. Gobber stared open-mouthed at his friend until he had disappeared. Anytime, he remarked wryly before turning back to the forge. Hiccup raced up the hill to his house, feeling a burst of energy that felt almost foreign to him. He forced himself to slow down so he didn't throw the door off its hinges. He made his way to the stairs, excited to give Finn the news. He stopped. The chief held his hands out in a calming motion, willing himself to relax. Finn didn't need him barging in and rambling about something he probably wouldn't care about. Just like everything in the past few weeks, he needed to handle this delicately. Hiccup resumed his trek up the stairs and walked to Finn's door. As usual, there was complete silence on the other side. Sadness crept back into his heart, but his determination to help his son won out. He wouldn't let this opportunity slip by because he was afraid of rejection. Softly rapping his knuckles against the door, he called, Finn. Can I come in? He waited 2 breaths before opening the door and carefully stepping inside. The bedroom was cluttered with clothing and random mementos from his son's various adventures. Finn sat in the far corner, his knees level to his chest and arms resting on them loosely. Finn continued to stare at the ceiling as if his father wasn't standing 4 feet away. The occasional blink was his only form of movement. Hey buddy, Hiccup tried, glancing at another plate of food sitting untouched on the desk. I saw Helga and some of the other kids hanging out earlier. They wanted me to tell you that they miss you. Finn made no attempts to move or respond. In fact, Hiccup wasn't sure if he'd even been heard. He remembered when they'd rescued Adriana from Trista and when she didn't run into his arms like he'd hoped and assumed. Finally he couldn't handle the stress any longer. He couldn't remember shutting down, that time was just an empty blur. Now, seeing his son in a similar state broke his heart and he wanted more than anything to break his stubborn will. Finn. Hiccup crouched in front of his son and looked him straight in the face. Come on buddy, please look at me. Just, give me something so I know you're still there. Nothing. Not even a flinch. Hiccup looked down at the floor, trying to decide what he should do. From the day he could crawl, Finn had always been active. Never before had he been this still for so long. He vaguely wondered if he should just hug his boy, maybe he'd snap out of it with physical contact, but he didn't want to lose any teeth. Finn could pack a mean reflexive punch whether he meant to or not. He was tired of trying and getting no results. He was tired of failed attempts to get through to him, just to turn around and leave the room to try again later. It was a repetitive cycle and it was killing everyone. Even Adriana seemed to be silently suffering with the house being so quiet. Everyone needed Finn's extra noise, it was a familial comfort, like the step thunk of his mismatched legs. I got you a job. Hiccup broke the silence again, glancing back up at Finn. His heart leaped when he saw a flicker of confusion on Finn's face, a short jerk of his eyebrows and downturn of his mouth, then he stilled again. Hiccup pressed on. Gobber said he could use an apprentice and we both think you'd be great at it. I mean, if a shrimp like me can benefit from working there then I can only imagine how much good it could do you. Right. Finn began to look more confused by the second. His eyes moved slowly across the ceiling and he still made no moves to speak, but his father could see the gears turning in his head. You can start whenever you feel ready. It's up to you. But I think it would be great. Having said that, Hiccup waited for the cricket in the room to chirp. Finally he sighed and gave his son a small smile. I love you, Finn. Things are going to get better. You'll see. With that he stood, fought the urge to ruffle his son's hair, and turned toward the door. A quick glance at Finn as the door swung closed showed him still seated motionless in the corner. The door clicked shut and he sighed, hoping that he'd done something right. As the door shut, Finn raised his head up from leaning against the wall. His neck groaned in protest, but he ignored the pain. He began to notice all the little aches and pains in his body, particularly his back and rear end from sitting on the hard floor for so long. He let his arms flop to the floor beside him. Blinking slowly, he tried to process his father's words. What had he said? He hadn't really heard most of it, it had sounded garbled and far away. But one word caught his attention, and cursed his curiosity: job. His father had gotten him a job. At the forge. With Gobber. The old guy was probably getting too senile to handle heavy weaponry anymore. He almost snorted. The old man would draw and quarter him with a scythe if he ever spoke that thought aloud. But a job. That was good, wasn't it? He could make some money, hang out with Helga and what? Finn fought the urge to throw something. But there was nothing on hand and he'd have to yank a boot off before launching it at the door. Nah, too much work. Got a job. PSH. With a sharp exhale, Finn pulled himself to his knees and dragged his pillow from underneath his bed. He buried his face and didn't have a care in the world that his back was twisted at an awkward angle. A sharp slam from somewhere in the house shook Finn awake. He heard a mumbled apology from his sister as she walked down the stairs. He groaned into his pillow, annoyed that his sister's room had the most drafts, so occasionally her door would slam shut. Despite sleeping on the floor, he felt surprisingly rested. His heart still ached, but he felt more awake than he had in weeks. He sat up and looked around his bedroom. Clothes, weapons, and other random things were strewn everywhere. He wasn't typically a neat person, but he liked some semblance of order, so he knew where things were. Suddenly he had the urge to clean. Within 10 minutes he straightened his room to near perfection. He was just throwing his clothes in the hamper when he saw movement out of the corner of his eye and looked up to see his mirror. It wasn't very big and sat leaned against the wall on top of his dresser. The boy staring back at him looked very unhealthy. He'd lost some weight recently, his long, fiery red hair desperately needed a wash and a cut, his freckled skin was pale and clammy. He reached a hand up to touch his face and he nearly gasped. He hadn't looked this terrible since. Finn gulped. Since Mayro. Painful images flooded his mind, tempting him to succumb to the pain once more, but he stamped them down. He squeezed his eyes shut and took a deep breath before glaring at himself in the mirror. This was ridiculous. He needed to get a grip on something. He couldn't waste away in here until Ragnarok. He had to do something. But he didn't feel up to hanging out with people. Not yet. The forge. Finn said aloud. He frowned at how weak his voice sounded from disuse and cleared it. His father told him early that morning that he had a job at the forge with Gobber. At the time it sounded outrageous and stupid, he'd never leave the house again. But now it sounded like the best thing that had happened since he didn't know when. Finn whipped around to grab his boots to leave, yanking them on in his sudden excitement, then he froze. He stared back at himself in the mirror and huffed loudly. Well, Finn, he yanked on his nearly shoulder-length hair. We've had better days. Rummaging through a shelf in his dresser, Finn found a knife and began giving himself a haircut. It took a while and he figured it probably wasn't even, but he wasn't going to have his mother cut this disgusting mop for him. He'd caused her enough grief already. He wasn't about to force that pleasurable experience on her. Minutes later he surveyed the finished product and he stuck his tongue out at himself. His hair was now shorter than he could remember it being, still an inch long at the nape of his neck and choppy layers throughout. He hadn't originally planned 4 layers, but cutting everything at the same length was proving more difficult than he'd hoped. He wanted to run his hands through it to feel its length, but he needed a bath. Badly. Finding a towel and a change of clothes was easy enough. He opted to come back after his bath to sweep up his hair. He reached for the door handle and jumped when it swung open from the other side. Astrid yelped in shock, staring open-mouthed at her son standing in the doorway. She shook herself out of her stupor with a blink. Finn. Finn blinked at her, unsure what to say. He hadn't actually spoken to anyone face to face he didn't actually want to think about how long. You're up. Astrid stepped closer, her expression still shocked. Your hair needed a trim. Again his mom's eyes widened in shock. He started to feel guilty that she was reacting this way. Had he really been that bad? Well, yeah, maybe it did. Astrid tried for a smile but it came on like grimace instead. She glanced down at the items in his arms and he felt the need to explain. Washroom. Oh, okay, Astrid replied as he walked past her. Do you need anything? I can make you breakfast. No thanks, Mom. I'm fine. Finn gave her a weak smile before descending the stairs. Astrid stood in the doorway, staring at the last place he'd stood. She pointed at the spot as if to ask it if he'd really been there. The mother turned into the bedroom and gasped aloud. He'd actually cleaned. The room was spot-okay, almost spotless. There was a distinct showering of clumpy red hair on the floor. Nearly jumping in excitement, Astrid tramped down the stairs to get the broom. Even if he said he was fine, she still wanted to make him a bowl of oatmeal in case he decided to eat. She wouldn't push him to eat it but she'd try anyway. After nearly 2.5 weeks of staring at walls, blank expressions, and night terrors, she couldn't believe Finn was finally coming around. It was beginning to seem hopeless. Maybe after Finn, hopefully, that she could take a flight into the village and find Hiccup. She didn't want to wait until dinner time to tell him the good news. Brandine Anderson didn't know much about terrible terrors but he did know that they weren't usually so persistent. He tried to swat the rather vocal terror away from his head but she continued to squawk and hold out her foot, looking thoroughly irritated with him. It was like she thought he was slow on the uptake, actually. Have you got a letter attached to your foot? Brandine asked incredulously. He knew terrors were used as messengers but who on earth would be writing to him? The red dragon stuck out her foot again with a noise that sounded like an exasperated huff. All right, don't get your skivvies in a twist, he mumbled to the reptile as he untied the note. What have we got here? His dark blue eyes scanned the parchment suspiciously, almost like he thought it might explode, before opening it and looking inside. The handwriting that met his eyes was tiny and untidy, almost like it had been scribbled out in a hurry. But the words were clear enough that he didn't have any difficulty reading them. Dear Brandine. I know we don't know each other very well but I didn't know who else to talk to. It's alright if you don't want to send letters but we really hit it off when we met a few weeks ago and I really want a friend right now. A close family friend of ours died not too long after we got back and, on top of all that, my best friend and I kind of had a falling out. I think he'll come around someday but, goodness, I don't want to dump all this on you now. I was hoping we could just be friends. Maybe. Dad said you were thinking about moving to Burke and we'd love to have you. Think about it, anyway. Your friend, hopefully. Anna. Brandine smiled widely. So the hooligan chief's daughter wanted to be friends. Excitement began to rise in his chest as he grabbed the closest piece of charcoal to reply to her letter. She had been funny, bright, and adorable. And the outcast girls weren't. Dear Anna. I'd love to be friends. And you can talk to me about anything. I'll try to listen or, read as closely as I can. Don't listen to what stupid people like your old friend say. You're pretty special. I really look forward to getting to know you. Ever yours. Brandine. Brandine read over his note 3 times before tying it to the dragon's leg and setting her free. Though he knew it was probably a bit presumptuous of him to think it, he liked a challenge and the haddock girl certainly presented one. A pretty young lady like that would not be won easily, especially if the best friend she'd fallen out with was this Eric fellow. But Brandine also knew that he was clever and charming. Perhaps this would be a fun challenge to work on while he waited to come of age. Then again, he had a year and a half. Anything could happen in that amount of time. Finn shoved his hands through his hair with a sigh of contentment. He couldn't remember when he'd had a haircut last, but he decided the feeling of soft, fluffy, newly cut hair had to be somewhere towards the top of the greatest feels list. Not that he'd admit that to anyone else. Even though he'd told his mother that he was fine, he actually ate most of the oatmeal she'd prepared. He wasn't sure what was more surprising, that he actually ate most of it or that he didn't eat all or more of it. On any given day he'd eat 3 bowls of it with nuts and berries. He felt pretty good. The walk to the barn to visit Tornado opened his lungs up and the chilly wind blew against his cheeks. A final glance in the mirror showed a pink tint to his skin from his bath, which improved his mood. Now he didn't look like he was about to keel over. The teenager could still feel the deep sadness in his chest, but he forced himself not to focus on it. He forced any trigger words out of his mind. Luckily Tornado's pen was already open for him to come and go as he pleased, so he didn't have to go inside the barn. Walking to it alone was enough to give him goosebumps, and not from the cold. With a silent huff, Finn looked toward the village. Everything seemed peaceful, but in fact, he dreaded showing his face. The last time everyone had seen him, he'd been in near shambles. He hadn't stepped foot outside since his father and Toothless apparently carried him home. His mother had been terrified they'd have to cut a few of his toes off from frostbite, but there was no damage. Furthermore, he hadn't spoken to anyone in weeks. He'd gotten a short kiss from Helga the day he left Mara's and they sat with Thorin and Kale and some of the other kids. But after it happened, he hadn't talked to anyone. No one sought him out. At the time he'd been glad that all of his friends backed off, but now he honestly wondered what was going on. His dad said they missed him, but even Helga hadn't shown up to check on him. Not that he would have responded anyway, but it was the thought that counted. Right. Finn scratched Tornado's brow a final time. All right, big guy, the teenager sighed. Better late than never. Tornado followed his young human toward the village, sniffing the salty sea air wafting in from the coast. He kept a close eye on Finn, who kept his eyes downcast as he walked. He seemed to be doing better than the last time they'd seen each other, but he could still tell the difference in behavior. He wanted his vivacious, confident little stoic back. The closer they got to the village, the more agitated Finn felt. He wasn't sure if it was nervousness or anxiety, but the thought of being in the public eye unnerved him. He quickened his steps as he entered the village, cursing the fact that the forge was the farthest from his house. He weaved through the small streets between houses to avoid people, picking his way past carts and barrels and hay bales. Finally he ran out of options and he had to walk through a street. People bustled to and fro like any other day, oblivious to the self-conscious teenager trying to run through unnoticed. He wasn't far from the forge now. He wondered what Gobber would teach him first. Would he start by sharpening swords or melting steel? Or would the old codger just have him dust the shelves and wash his skivvies? He wanted to believe that was just a rumor, but Helga was insistent her mother and uncle had had to do such a heinous thing after one particular prank. Yeah, he didn't want to know what kind of prank deserved that sort of punishment. His father had worked as apprentice at the forge for years. Various inventions and machines were still used day in and day out as a result of Gobber's tutelage and his father's innovation. Finn almost wished he'd talked to his father before going to the forge, but he wasn't going to scour the village for the man. He could be anywhere. If Finn weren't so miserable, he might have been excited. He liked hard, physically demanding work and he knew he'd probably be taking a majority of it with Gobber's muscles starting to fail. It was a hopeful prospect to say the least, and it was enough to keep his head up and his mind comparatively clear. He noticed several glances in his direction as he strode through the village square, but he determinedly ignored them. He was here for one job and one job only. Nothing would get in the way. Except Inga. Then again, it seemed second nature for her to find a way to irritate him to no end. Finn nearly ran into the girl when she came out of seemingly nowhere and blocked his path. "What are you doing here?" Finn asked in a suspicious voice, raising an eyebrow at her. Inga held up a plate of what looked like beige-colored blobs. "I'm here to raise morale. By showing people your rock collection." "Hardy ha ha." Inga rolled her eyes. "They're cookies, stupidhead. I'm pretty sure I know what cookies look like." Finn crossed his arms. "Well, it's my first time making them, so they don't look perfect, but since when do you demand perfection?" Inga held the plate closer to his face. "You know, an assassination attempt on a future chief is punishable by death." "I'm not assassinating you." Inga growled, her cheerful smile melting into a frown. "It's not like I poisoned them. Why would I do that? Hey, if you take out the Haddock clan, the Jorgensons take power. You have motive, means, opportunity, and you can cry on command. I've seen you do it. Feigning innocence would be easy. Finn condescendingly patted her on the head. Thanks but no thanks. I'd like to see my 17th birthday. Just take a freaking cookie. Inga snapped. No. Darn it, Finn, I worked really hard on these. Inga stuck out her lower lip in a pout. Or. I literally just said I know you can cry on command, so put a sock in it. Finn narrowed his eyes at her. He'd forgotten how much fun it was to antagonize her. And the best part was that it seemed to be second nature, an instinct that wouldn't go away no matter what he was feeling. He liked it. I'll be late for work, so if you don't have any more attempts on my life planned. He began to stride away with his hands in the air. Fearless Finn Haddock, you are, you. Inga gritted her teeth and stomped her foot in agitation, making Finn smile wider. She grabbed a cookie off the plate and pitched it at him. He effortlessly caught it. Well, considering how hard these are, I'd say if you hit me the right way, I could die. Weak attempt, but hey, I'm feeling generous today. I'll give it a 6. Finn chortled at the red shade that was beginning to envelope the Jorgensen girl's face. He left her to her irritated growls, laughing for the first time in weeks. He would never say it to her face, but he was just starting to enjoy her company. They weren't friends exactly, but he found himself with an odd sort of affection for her. An affection strong enough for him to cave and take a bite of the cookie she'd made. Well, he thought as his teeth nearly broke, there's one thing we don't have in common. He turned back to announce this when his insides turned to ice. The moment he lay eyes on her, she suddenly collapsed stiffly, her plate shattering and cookies flying in all directions. Again, her muscles seized, her mouth frothed, her eyes fluttered and rolled around aimlessly. Inga. Heather and the twins were running up. The Jorgensen matriarch threw a hand in front of both boys to stop them from touching their sister. Benen's words echoed through Finn's mind as he watched a small crowd gather around the seizing girl. A feeling of panic rose through him and he felt his legs go out. He fell heavily on Tornado, who helped him stand again. And then suddenly the feeling returned to his legs and, almost of their own accord, he turned and ran away from the scene. He could hear his breath coming in short gasps as he hurtled toward the forge, desperately trying to get the sight of Inga's twitching form out of his mind. Finn ran into the forge, skidding around a wall and shoving his back against a hanging rack. His heart pounded in his chest like a drum and he felt his anxiety rising by the second. He finally got here and Tornado took off somewhere, he couldn't break down now. Well, hi there. Finn jumped as he caught sight of Gobber walking in from the back room, a hammer attachment on his hand prosthetic. If the elderly man noticed the boy's oncoming panic attack, he didn't comment on it. So you want to learn the ropes of the forge, eh? Nice haircut, by the way. The teenager gulped, running a hand through his hair. He could feel his hand shaking. Ah. Finn exhaled heavily, trying to get some kind of grip. Finn. Look at me. The boy looked at Gobber nervously and saw only compassion. If you want to work here, you need to focus. You don't need to be losing any limbs. At least not yet. Gobber smirked. But if you don't feel ready yet, it's fine, we can. No. Finn wiped the sweat off his upper lip and nodded shakily. Ah. I'm fine. Gobber nodded swiftly. All right then. Come here. First things first, always wear an apron. I don't care how old you are, if I find you working in here without an apron on, well, ask your father what the consequences are. The elderly man was quick to give instruction and often used biting sarcasm and overly exaggerated stories in random places of the conversation, but Finn found it comforting. He was able to forget about the incident with Inga enough to focus on his words, although he did feel a bit of relief when he noticed Inga shakily walking past the forge with Heather and her brothers at her side. Within half an hour, Finn was sweating. Within a full hour, Gobber had taught him a huge portion of the trade, how to stoke the fires and clean the tools, because the key to a good forge is its hot fires and clean tools, sharpen swords, because the key to a good bloody battle is its sharp swords, and pound the kinks and dents out of bent weapons. Good gods, how did his father work for this guy for nearly 20 years? There you go, Finn. Gobber dropped an armful of bent swords, daggers, arrows and other dull weapons. Sharpen those till you could cut a chicken in half. Finn inspected a dull arrowhead. Literally. Gobber cuffed him on the head, making the boy smirk a little. Your father said the same thing, but he was younger. I don't know what's worse, a Snooky 12-year-old or his Snooky son over 20 years later. I'll be back in a bit to check on ya, don't burn the place down. You didn't leave the skivvies over the fire, did you? I learned my lesson. Finn bit back a laugh and hefted a mighty sword that looked like it had weathered a yak stampede. He heated the metal until he knew it was ready for pounding. The blade was bent and he fiddled with it on the anvil for a few seconds, trying to get a proper angle. The first swing was awkward and sparks flew. Now he was thankful for the apron. The second swing burned his hand, but he forced himself to keep going. The next few swings were better, though his hand felt like it was both on fire and vibrating. He already couldn't wait until he was used to this. Something about pounding the metal awakened something inside of him and he began to hit the sword with quick, fluid strikes. His arms grew steadily tired but he decided that it was a good feeling after sitting idle for so long. The misshapen sword was stubborn and didn't want to bend, but he was more stubborn. He would pound this thing all night until it was straighter than his mother's teeth. But there was something else. He felt something rise in his chest, something hot and burning. He paused to see if a spark had landed on his shirt, but there was nothing there. The feeling didn't pass. Finn stared at the anvil and the sword and hammer in his hands. Were his ears ringing from the banging, or something else? Without another thought, he set the sword again and continued to pound it. The more he pounded, the more intense the feeling became. He racked his brain trying to decide what this feeling was. Confusion. Anxiety. Panic. Desperation. He felt swirls of these things but this was different. It was searing hot. It was deep and cutting. It was unforgiving and relentless. Finn was angry. Instantly so many reasons for this new emotion flooded his mind. He was angry at himself for not being more careful at the barn. If he'd paid better attention to the roof and crumbling structure, Binnen would still be here. This whole thing could have been prevented from the very start. He was angry at his father for not coming sooner, heck, for allowing them to go to the barn in the first place. He'd been on the fence about letting them go before they left. Why hadn't he done the chiefly thing, like he usually did, and say no? He was angry that Inga had gone to get the stupid ingredient and had gotten hurt as a result, and he was even angrier that the adults, especially Mara and her parents, had allowed her to go. He was angry at the villagers for their false sympathy and pointless gifts that were somehow meant to make him feel better. He was angry at Binnen for stealing his heart and leaving him shattered and broken when he was needed the most. And most of all he was angry at himself for appearing weak. No, not appearing weak. Being weak. Sitting on the floor in his room for so long he couldn't remember when he'd talked last. Weakness. Allowing this grief to consume him for so long. Weakness. Turning tail when Inga collapsed in another fit because he couldn't handle it. Weakness. If Finn hated anything more than cruelty, it was weakness. Fueling his anger, he thought back to his short time as a slave. That evil man Javan selling him to slave traders, the traders stripping him and branding him like a common animal, Ratri beating him until blood poured down his shoulders for not scrubbing a foul, pigpen of a floor properly, scrubbing said floors until his fingers bled. The world was cruel. The world was wicked. It kept the wicked and took the good. It snatched love and goodness away from people and replaced it with hate and bitterness. If love was only to ever end in pain and suffering, just as it always had for his sister, why would he want it? If that's what love meant, then he didn't want it. Love is weakness. Finn growled at the sword, slamming the hammer into the body of the sword. Only the strong can survive. Forcing himself to ignore the burning pain of his weak muscles, he pounded the sword a final time until it cracked down the center. The end of the sword clanged to the floor as he panted heavily. Turning, he dumped the remaining half of the sword into a scrap bin to be melted down. Glaring out the back door toward the ocean, Finn grasped the necklace tied around his neck, the last gift Binnen had ever given him. Using it as his fuel, he would never fall this far and hard again. He would be strong. He would be fearless. Fortis. This is Burke. Relationships are the foundation of our community. We constantly rely on the promises of others for survival. Without dependence on one another, our whole way of life disintegrates. Though having faith in people is not easy, trusting those you love the most can be a challenge, and, once in a while, we promise too much. After the hardships of betrayal, you can become protective of yourself. Blinded by pain, you shove the ones you love away, and with no one to turn to, set up yourself for a lifetime of loneliness. And by pushing away your loved ones, you cause more pain to yourself than from those who hurt you. An unintended consequence of this mindset is that you may be shoving away the people who love you the most just because we let you down, even if by mistake. You reject the people who care enough about you to beg for forgiveness and do everything we can to restore your confidence. And so, in the process, you end up breaking more hearts than just your own. The end.